Troy Parker had never been the kind of man who dreamed big. He'd grown up in the rusted corners of Detroit, raised by a father who taught him more about broken engines than broken promises. Now in his 30s, Troy owned a small, cluttered mechanic shop on the edge of town, where the walls were lined with dusty old toolboxes and mismatched parts. Most days, he patched up rusty pickup trucks for folks who couldn't afford new ones. And though money was tight, he'd never turned away a customer who really needed help, whether they could pay or not. On a cold Tuesday morning in March, Troy was finishing up his last job, a battered Ford whose owner had left him a $10 tip and a thank you note. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with a rag, stepped outside, and noticed an unfamiliar sight. A sleek black limousine parked awkwardly by the curb. Its polished chrome wheels and tinted windows looked painfully out of place next to the cracked sidewalk and broken streetlights. A well-dressed chauffeur stepped out, adjusting his cap with crisp movements. "Mr. Parker?" the man asked, his eyes flicking from Troy's greasy coveralls to the oil-splattered garage behind him. "Yeah?" Troy answered, unsure what to make of the fancy visitor. The chauffeur handed him a white envelope with gold-embossed letters that read, "Kingsley Estate." Inside was a note, handwritten in elegant loops. It was from Margaret Kingsley, a name Troy recognized from the city's gossip columns. The Kingsleys were old money, the kind of people who donated libraries, sponsored galas, and lived in mansions with more bathrooms than Troy had ever seen in his life. The note was short. "I need someone who can fix what others cannot. Please come immediately. Name your price." Curiosity got the better of him. An hour later, Troy found himself gripping the worn steering wheel of his battered Chevy truck, following the limousine through neighborhoods that grew cleaner, brighter, and richer the closer they got to the Kingsley estate. He drove past iron gates taller than any fence he'd seen, under towering trees that lined a driveway so long it could hide a dozen cars. When he parked beside the limo, he felt painfully aware of his faded jacket, scuffed boots, and hands stained with grease. He stepped out anyway, trying not to stare at the grand house looming ahead, white pillars, spotless windows, and a front lawn so green it looked painted on. A maid greeted him at the door with a polite but stiff nod, leading him through hallways that smelled faintly of flowers and polished wood. Oil stains followed Troy's boots as he stepped carefully over marble floors and priceless rugs. They stopped at the entrance to a vast study lined with books from floor to ceiling. Sitting in a leather armchair was Margaret Kingsley herself. She wore a tailored grey suit and pearl earrings that probably cost more than Troy's entire shop. But what caught his eye was her face, pale, exhausted, with eyes so red-rimmed it looked like she hadn't slept in days. Beside her sat a small girl in a wheelchair. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a loose braid, and she clutched a battered stuffed dog so tight the seams had nearly split open. Troy felt a twist in his chest when he saw the girl's thin legs resting limp against the footrests. "Thank you for coming on short notice, Mr. Parker," Mrs. Kingsley said, her voice cool but cracking at the edges. "My daughter's wheelchair ramp is broken. I've had the best contractors here, but none could fix it properly. It jams, stops, and sometimes refuses to lower at all. She's terrified of using it now." Troy nodded, stepping closer. He could feel the child's eyes following him, wide and curious. "I'll take a look," he said softly. The ramp was attached to the back terrace, leading down to a small garden lined with rose bushes. Troy knelt beside it, running his fingers along the motor housing. He felt the telltale catch of a stripped gear and spotted rust creeping through the metal. It was shoddy work, expensive but careless. While he worked, he heard soft giggles behind him. Turning, he saw the girl peeking at him from her chair. She looked shy but fascinated by his tools, spread out like little treasures. "What's your name?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "Anna," she whispered, her voice so small it nearly vanished in the spring breeze. "Nice to meet you, Anna," he said with a warm grin. "Do you want to help me fix this?" She looked at her mother, who was standing a few feet away, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Margaret's lips pressed together, torn between wanting to shield her daughter and needing something, anything, to work. She gave the smallest nod. Troy showed Anna a small wrench, letting her hold it, while he explained what he was doing. He found himself telling her about the gears, the wires, and the little motor that needed replacing. To his surprise, she asked questions, good ones, sharp ones. When he finished patching the ramp for the day, Anna was laughing, a sound so bright and sudden it made her mother flinch. Margaret looked at Troy as if she wasn't sure whether to thank him or throw him out for giving her daughter false hope. But when Anna whispered, "Mummy, maybe Mr. Troy can help me walk too," something in Margaret's steely resolve cracked. She didn't stop Troy when he bent down to Anna's level and said, "Well, kiddo, I've fixed a lot of things people said were impossible. Maybe we can try this too." The sun dipped lower behind the garden walls as Troy packed up his tools. The Kingsleys' world smelled like roses and wealth, but for the first time in a long time, Troy felt like he'd stepped into something bigger than broken engines. And as he walked back to his battered truck, he knew one thing for certain: he'd be back tomorrow, whether she could pay him or not. Troy's truck rumbled up the Kingsley driveway the next morning, just as dawn cracked the sky open with a wash of pale gold. He hadn't slept much. Instead, he'd spent half the night hunting through his old boxes of parts and scraps, grabbing anything he thought might help. He couldn't shake the sound of Anna's tiny voice in his head. "Maybe Mr. Troy can help me walk too." Margaret Kingsley met him at the door this time, wearing a simple sweater and no jewelry. The steel in her eyes was back, but it looked thinner now, chipped by exhaustion and an unspoken fear. She led him through the sunlit hallways in silence until they reached Anna's room. Anna sat by the big window in her chair, sunlight spilling across her small frame as she traced her finger along the glass. She turned when Troy knocked gently on the doorframe. Her grin was instant, bright as a spring bloom. "Hi, Mr. Troy," she called, her voice a little louder today. "Hey there, boss lady," he teased, stepping in with his toolbox clanking at his side. Margaret stood back, arms crossed, but this time she didn't say a word as Troy knelt in front of Anna. He pulled out a small motorized brace he'd rigged together from spare parts and an old kid's scooter motor. It looked rough, a Frankenstein patchwork of metal and plastic, but it worked in theory. And sometimes theory was all you needed to take the first step. "I thought maybe we could try something today," he said, holding up the brace like a magician showing a card trick. "You up for an experiment?" Anna's eyes went huge. She nodded so hard her braid bounced against her shoulder. Margaret stepped closer, her breath catching when Troy gently slipped the brace around Anna's tiny leg, adjusting the straps and checking the wires twice. He talked her through every piece, explaining it simply but seriously. He made her part of it, the way his dad had done for him when he was a boy fixing a lawnmower on the porch. When the brace whirred softly to life, Anna gasped. Troy steadied her foot with both hands. Margaret clutched the windowsill, knuckles white. "Okay, Anna, ready to try?" he asked. She nodded again. Very carefully, with Troy supporting her knee and ankle, he guided her foot to press down. The brace hissed and pushed back, giving just enough resistance to encourage her muscles to work. At first, it was just a twitch, then another. Anna looked at Troy, then at her mother, eyes filling with something fierce, something Margaret hadn't seen in years. An hour slipped by like nothing. Troy adjusted screws, added a new strip of padding, showed Anna how to push against the brace's motor. Each small motion was a miracle. By the time he stopped, she could hold her foot down for 2 seconds at a time. 2 seconds felt like forever. Margaret knelt beside them, her expensive perfume mixing with the scent of motor oil on Troy's sleeves. "Is this really going to work?" she asked, her voice cracking. Troy looked at her, then at Anna. "It's not perfect, but it's a start. She's stronger than most folks I've met, Mom. She's got this." They met every day after that. Troy came early, stayed late. He brought spare braces, small motors, tiny adjustable rods. He taught Anna how to push, hold, release. They moved from the brace to a second one, then to parallel bars Troy built in the Kingsley's basement workshop. Margaret watched every session like a hawk, but slowly something in her thawed. One morning, after 3 weeks, Troy arrived to find Margaret waiting with 2 steaming cups of coffee. She handed him one without a word. He nodded his thanks, and they stood side by side on the porch, watching the sun climb through the spring trees. That day, when Anna gripped the parallel bars, her small legs trembling under the braces, Margaret didn't stand back. She dropped to her knees next to Troy and whispered, "Come on, baby, come on." Anna's feet shuffled, awkward but determined. Her breath came in sharp gasps, and then, just before she lost balance, she took one tiny, perfect step forward. Margaret covered her mouth with both hands, her shoulders shaking with a sound she hadn't made in years. A sob so raw, it made Troy look away to give her the moment. He felt his own eyes sting, but he just steadied Anna, whispering, "Atta girl, kiddo. Let's do another." Word spread quietly through the Kingsley household. Staff peeked in from doorways. The chauffeur who had brought Troy that first day gave him a subtle thumbs up in the hallway. The mansion felt less like marble and more like something alive, warm with the heartbeat of a family fighting for something real. When the day came for Anna to step out onto the back patio under her own power, Margaret called the whole staff to watch. Troy stood off to the side, arms folded, grease smudges on his sleeves. Anna took 3 trembling steps across the patio stones before her legs gave out. Margaret was there before she could fall, scooping her up and burying her face in her daughter's hair. Troy turned away again, pretending to check a wrench he didn't need. He knew he'd never be rich, but as Margaret Kingsley cried into his shoulder that afternoon, whispering thank you over and over, he realized some kinds of wealth had nothing to do with bank accounts. He'd fixed engines his whole life, but this was the first time he'd helped rebuild hope, and as he drove home that night in his battered truck, he knew he'd be back tomorrow and the day after, until Anna didn't need him anymore.